The message, 14th of April, 1943. Early morning hours, Hawaii time. Commander Edwin Layton stood in the operations room at Pacific Fleet headquarters, holding a decoded message that made his hands tremble. Marine Major Alva Laswell had worked through the night to decrypt a Japanese naval transmission, and what it revealed seemed impossible. A complete itinerary for Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese combined fleet, down to the minute, placing him within American fighter range in 72 hours. This has to be a trap, Layton whispered to himself, studying the precise timetable again. No military commander would broadcast his movements with such specificity. What Layton didn't know was that Yamamoto's legendary punctuality, the very trait that made him such an effective administrator, was about to become his executioner. The decrypt lay on Layton's desk like a loaded weapon. Every detail was there: arrival times and departure times, aircraft types, escort numbers, even the khaki-green army uniforms Yamamoto would wear. The intelligence was so perfect, it seemed designed to lure American fighters into a massacre. Layton had served as naval attaché in Tokyo, had known Yamamoto personally, understood his methodical nature. But this level of operational detail in a radio message defied every principle of military security. The Japanese codes were supposed to be unbreakable. That's what the Japanese believed. That's what many Americans had believed until Station Hypo proved otherwise. Admiral Chester Nimitz arrived within the hour. He read the message twice, then looked up at Layton with eyes that held both opportunity and dread. "Do we try to get him?" Nimitz asked. "Would the Japanese be able to replace him with someone better?" The question hung in the room like smoke. Layton thought of Yamamoto's unique position, his stature among the Japanese people, his creative tactical thinking that had conceived Pearl Harbor, his understanding of American industrial capacity that made him reluctant about war in the first place. "No one can replace him, sir," Layton said finally. "He's irreplaceable." What neither man said aloud was the other question burning in both their minds. Was killing one admiral worth risking the greatest intelligence advantage of the war? The mathematics were staggering. The intercepted message indicated a flight of approximately 430 nautical miles from Rabaul to Balale Island, well beyond the range of any American fighter except one. The P-38 Lightning, with external fuel tanks, could theoretically make the round trip of nearly 1,000 miles. Theoretically. The mission would require flying at wave-top altitude for fuel efficiency, navigating over open ocean with nothing but dead reckoning, arriving at a specific point in the sky within a window of perhaps 10 minutes, engaging enemy aircraft, and returning home before fuel exhaustion. The margins were so thin they approached zero. One navigation error of 5 degrees would mean missing the intercept point by 50 miles. 1 minute's delay in takeoff would mean arriving after Yamamoto had landed. 1 minute too early would mean orbiting in hostile airspace until Japanese radar spotted the American fighters and scrambled every zero on Bougainville. The intelligence advantage itself represented a disparity almost too large to calculate. Since mid-1942, American cryptanalysts had been reading Japanese naval communications with increasing reliability. The Japanese sent thousands of encrypted messages daily, believing their codes were mathematically unbreakable. They were wrong. Station Hypo in Hawaii, Station Nagat in Washington, Station Cast now relocated to Australia, all were reading Japanese mail. The Americans knew fleet movements before some Japanese captains did. They knew supply schedules, fuel states, aircraft numbers, commander assignments, operational plans. This asymmetry of information had already contributed to the American victory at Midway. but using the intelligence required artistry. Use it too obviously, and the Japanese would realize their codes were compromised. Then the intelligence window would slam shut, possibly forever. The question wasn't whether killing Yamamoto was militarily valuable. The question was whether it was worth potentially losing the ability to read every Japanese operational order for the remainder of the war. The world as Commander Layton understood it in April of 1943 was one of desperate calculations and marginal advantages. The United States had been at war for 16 months. The naval balance in the Pacific remained precarious despite Midway. Japanese forces still controlled vast territories from Burma to the Gilbert Islands, from the Kuriles to the Dutch East Indies. American industrial production was ramping up, but had not yet achieved the overwhelming superiority it would reach by 1944. Every engagement remained uncertain. Every tactical advantage mattered. The Japanese still possessed veteran pilots, experienced commanders, interior lines of communication, and bases closer to their home islands. American forces operated at the end of supply lines stretching thousands of miles across the Pacific. Fuel, ammunition, aircraft, spare parts, food, everything had to come by ship through submarine-infested waters. Victory was not inevitable. It was something that had to be constructed from 1,000 small advantages, carefully exploited. Layton's background made him uniquely qualified to assess Yamamoto's significance. He had served 3 years in Tokyo as a Japanese language officer before the war, had attended diplomatic functions, had conversed with Japanese naval officers, including Yamamoto himself. He understood Japanese military culture, the reverence for certain leaders, the importance of face and reputation. Yamamoto was not just another admiral. He was a symbol of Japanese naval power, a figure who commanded respect even from those who disagreed with his strategic assessments. His opposition to war with America had been well known in 1941, though he had prosecuted the war with full energy once ordered to do so. His knowledge of America, gained through years of study at Harvard and service as naval attaché in Washington, gave him insights no other Japanese commander possessed. He understood American industrial capacity, American determination, American strategic thinking. That knowledge made him dangerous, but it also made him potentially valuable in any future peace negotiations. Killing him might prolong the war by removing a voice of reason from Japanese councils, or it might shorten the war by decapitating Japanese naval leadership. The calculation was impossible to make with certainty. Admiral Nimitz's query to Washington brought the decision to the highest levels. Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, discussed it with military intelligence chiefs. The Office of Naval Intelligence examined the question from every angle. Would acting on this intelligence compromise the code breaking? Almost certainly the Japanese would investigate how Americans happened to intercept Yamamoto's flight. Could the intercept be explained by other means? Perhaps. Australian coast watchers operated throughout the Solomon Islands. Japanese flights were sometimes spotted and reported. A lucky encounter was plausible, if not probable. But if the Japanese examined the evidence carefully, if they noticed patterns in American responses to their coded messages, if they compared the timing and precision of this intercept with other suspicious incidents, they might conclude their codes were broken. That conclusion would be catastrophic. The code-breaking operation represented years of mathematical work, linguistic expertise, captured code books, and painstaking analysis. Losing it would blind American commanders, just as the Pacific War entered its crucial phase. President Franklin Roosevelt was traveling when the message arrived, and documentation of his direct involvement remains unclear. But a decision of this magnitude almost certainly reached his attention. Knox gave Nimitz authorization to proceed, though Knox later maintained the final choice rested with Nimitz himself. This allocation of responsibility was deliberate. If the mission failed, if it compromised code breaking, if it produced unanticipated consequences, the decision would be Nimitz's. The Admiral understood this. He spent hours considering the question before making his choice. Intelligence officer Thomas Dyer, who worked with Laswell on the decrypt, later recalled Nimitz's somber mood during those deliberations. He knew what was at stake. Dyer testified in post-war interviews. He knew we might be trading the best intelligence source of the war for one man, even if that man was Yamamoto. But he also knew opportunities like this don't come twice. Yamamoto would never again be so close to our fighters, never again broadcast his itinerary so precisely. This was our chance. Maybe our only chance. Nimitz gave the order. 4 words in a message to Admiral William Halsey, commander of South Pacific Forces. Get Yamamoto. Best luck. Layton drafted the operational orders with careful attention to the cover story. All pilots were to be briefed that intelligence came from Australian coast watchers near Rabaul. This fiction was tissue-thin, but necessary. Nimitz added a handwritten postscript to the orders. Best of luck and good hunting. The message went out on the morning of April 15th, Rabaul time, giving Halsey barely 60 hours to plan and execute a mission unlike anything attempted before. Shoot down a specific aircraft, carrying a specific individual at a specific time and place, nearly 500 miles from the nearest American airfield, without revealing how Americans knew he would be there. The margin for error existed somewhere between negligible and non-existent. Admiral Halsey received Nimitz's orders at his headquarters on the island of Efate. He immediately summoned Admiral Mark Mitcher, commander of air operations in the Solomon Islands, and his aviation staff. The group studied maps and capabilities. No Navy fighter had the range. The mission required Army Air Force P-38 Lightnings, the only aircraft in theater capable of the distance. 3 P-38 squadrons operated from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, recently reinforced with additional aircraft. Their pilots had combat experience against Japanese fighters and bombers. But this mission would push every capability to its absolute limit. The round-trip distance approached 900 miles. Normal P-38 range with internal fuel was approximately 400 miles. Even with external drop tanks, the mission would require perfect navigation, minimal combat time, and no contingencies. One damaged engine, one navigation error, one unexpected delay, and the returning fighters would ditch in the ocean hundreds of miles from land. The Navy planners initially suggested attacking Yamamoto's sub-chaser as he traveled between Balale Island and Shortland Island. The message indicated he would make this journey by boat, a slow-moving vulnerable target. Navy officers described their concept using maritime terminology, talking about attack angles and approach vectors in nautical language. Army Major John Mitchell, commander of the 339th Fighter Squadron, listened with increasing confusion. Port quarter? What does that mean? Mitchell finally interrupted. I don't know the difference between a sub-chaser and a submarine. What if there are several boats? How do we identify which one? What if he survives and swims to shore? We're fighter pilots, not ship attackers. We should take him in the air. Mitcher considered this for perhaps 10 seconds before deciding. He's right. We get him. In the air. The mission was set for the following day, April 18th. Mitchell had less than 24 hours to plan every detail of the most ambitious fighter intercept ever attempted. Major Mitchell spent that night in Mitcher's operations room with Navy navigation specialists, calculating courses and fuel consumption rates down to the gallon. The direct route from Henderson Field to Balal Island was approximately 350 miles. But flying direct would take the P-38s over Japanese-held islands, where coast watchers and radar would spot them. The Americans needed surprise. Mitchell plotted a route far out to sea, southwest of the Solomon chain, adding nearly 200 miles to the outbound leg. The P-38s would fly at wave-top altitude, below radar coverage, navigating by compass and dead reckoning. At the calculated intercept point northwest of Balal, they would climb to attack altitude. The timing had to be exact. Yamamoto's message indicated arrival at Balale at 9:45 a.m. local time. Mitchell calculated his fighters should arrive 10 minutes earlier, 9:35 a.m., catching Yamamoto's flight as it descended toward landing. 10 minutes before landing, Yamamoto would be at low altitude, vulnerable, focused on arrival procedures rather than watching for enemy fighters. Each P-38 would carry 2 external drop tanks, one standard 165-gallon tank and one oversized 330-gallon tank. This added fuel load of 495 gallons more than doubled the aircraft's normal fuel capacity. But it also added tremendous weight and drag. Takeoff would require nearly the full length of Henderson Field's runway. The fighters would be sluggish and vulnerable until they burned off fuel. The mismatched tanks would create asymmetric drag, requiring constant trim adjustments. And the fuel consumption calculations were brutal. Mitchell's navigation specialists computed fuel burn rates at different altitudes and speeds. Flying low, at high power settings to stay airborne with a heavy fuel load, the P-38s would consume fuel at nearly maximum rates. Even with the external tanks, the mission would leave perhaps 10 minutes of loiter time at the intercept point. 10 minutes to find Yamamoto's flight, engage, and break off. Any longer, and the returning P-38s would run out of fuel before reaching Henderson Field. Some might make the emergency airstrip in the Russell Islands, 60 miles southeast of Guadalcanal. But anyone running dry beyond that would ditch in the ocean. Mitchell gathered 18 pilots from all 3 P-38 squadrons at Henderson Field, the best combat pilots available. He briefed them without identifying their target, referring only to a Japanese VIP. The cover story about Australian coast watchers was included in the briefing, though Mitchell suspected most pilots saw through it immediately. The precision of the intelligence, the extraordinary nature of the mission, the unprecedented planning effort, all pointed toward code breaking rather than Coast Watcher reports. But the pilots asked no questions. They understood operational security. They understood some things were not discussed. Lieutenant Rex Barber later recalled, "We knew. Maybe we weren't supposed to know, but we knew. You don't mount a mission like that for just any Japanese officer." And the intelligence was too perfect, too specific. Someone was reading their mail. We all understood that. We all understood we couldn't say it. Mitchell divided the 18 pilots into 2 groups. 4 aircraft would be the killer group, tasked with shooting down the bombers. 14 aircraft would be the cover group, protecting the killers from Japanese fighters and providing backup. 2 pilots in the cover group were designated spares in case of mechanical problems. The 4 killer pilots were the most experienced: Captain Thomas Lanphier, Lieutenant Rex Barber, Lieutenant Besby Holmes, and Lieutenant Raymond Hine. All had multiple confirmed victories against Japanese aircraft. All had demonstrated aggressive tactical instincts. Mitchell would lead the mission and fly with the cover group, coordinating the overall operation. His plan called for the cover group to maintain altitude and position to intercept Japanese fighters while the killer group dove on the bombers. Get in fast, shoot the bombers, Get out fast. No loitering, no dogfighting, no trying to rack up 0 kills. Mission was to kill the bombers and escape. The fuel calculations allowed nothing else. Palm Sunday, April 18th, 1943. 0700 hours local time. Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. The 18 P-38s sat in a long line on the runway, each loaded with 3,000 pounds of extra fuel slung under their wings in mismatched drop tanks. Admiral Mitcher stood at the end of the runway, watching each aircraft as it prepared for takeoff. The fighters would need nearly the full 2,000-foot runway length to get airborne with their massive fuel loads. One by one, the P-38s rolled forward, engines roaring, slowly accelerating, using every foot of available runway before finally lifting into the morning air. The first mechanical failure occurred immediately. One fighter had a tire blowout during takeoff, causing the pilot to abort before leaving the ground. Once airborne, another pilot discovered his external tanks weren't feeding properly. He couldn't draw fuel from the drop tanks, which meant he lacked the range for the mission. He waggled his wings and turned back. Both aborted aircraft had been part of the killer group. Mitchell hastily reassigned 2 cover group pilots to fill the gaps. Now 16 P-38s formed up and headed out to sea. Major Mitchell led the formation southwest, away from the Solomon Islands, flying barely 50 feet above the ocean, surface. At this altitude, the fighters were invisible to Japanese radar on Bougainville. But the navigation challenge was immense. With no landmarks, no radio beacons, nothing but open ocean, Mitchell relied entirely on his compass, a Navy ship's compass specially mounted in his P-38 cockpit. He calculated course changes based on elapsed time and estimated wind drift. Every few minutes, he glanced at his watch and his compass, comparing actual progress to his flight plan. 1 degree of error maintained for an hour would result in missing the intercept point by a mile. The formation flew in radio silence, maintaining tight positions, following Mitchell's lead. Below them, the Pacific Ocean stretched in every direction, empty and vast. No ships, no islands, nothing but water and sky. Flying this low, in radio silence, with fuel consumption ticking away minute by minute, required concentration and trust. The pilots trusted Mitchell's navigation. They trusted their engines. They trusted the intelligence that had planned this mission. Every assumption had to be correct, or they would die, either in combat or when their fuel ran out over the ocean. After flying the planned outbound leg for approximately 1 hour and 50 minutes, Mitchell led the formation in a turn toward the northwest, beginning the final approach to the intercept point. The P-38s started climbing from their wavetop altitude toward attack positions. The cover group climbed to 18,000 feet. The killer group climbed to 10,000 feet. Mitchell checked his watch against his flight plan. 9:34 a.m. local time. They were 1 minute early, which was essentially perfect given the distance and navigation challenges. He scanned the sky, searching. The intercept point was somewhere near them. But the sky appeared empty. Perhaps the intelligence was wrong. Perhaps Yamamoto had changed his plans. Perhaps the timing was off. Then, at 9:35 a.m., Lieutenant Douglas Canning's voice broke radio silence. "Bogies, 11 o'clock high." Mitchell spotted them immediately. 2 twin-engine bombers with 6 Zero fighters as escorts, exactly where and when the intelligence had predicted they would be. The navigation had been perfect. The timing had been perfect. The intelligence had been perfect. Everything was perfect except that there were 2 bombers instead of 1. The message had mentioned only Yamamoto's aircraft. Mitchell had planned the killer group's size based on attacking 1 bomber. Now there were 2 bombers and only 4 attackers to engage both, while 6 Zeros tried to stop them. "Drop tanks," Mitchell ordered. The P-38s released their external fuel tanks, losing the weight and drag, but also losing their reserve fuel for the return journey. Now they were committed. The killer group dove toward the Japanese formation, while the cover group positioned to intercept the Zero fighters. But Lieutenant Besby Holmes, one of the killer pilots, had a problem. His drop tanks hadn't released. He yanked his emergency release handle repeatedly, while his aircraft bucked and wobbled under the asymmetric load. His wingman, Lieutenant Raymond Hine, stayed with him, refusing to abandon his element leader. Meanwhile, Captain Lanfear and Lieutenant Barber dove immediately toward the Japanese formation. The Japanese bombers spotted the attacking P-38s and dove sharply, heading for the jungle at maximum speed. The 6 Zero fighters rolled into dives, trying to intercept the American fighters before they reached the bombers. Lanfear flew directly at the diving Zeros, guns firing, breaking up their formation and causing them to scatter defensively. Barber veered hard, right to avoid a head-on collision with a Zero, and in that violent maneuver found himself perfectly positioned behind one of the diving bombers. The bomber was low now, barely above the jungle canopy, racing at maximum speed toward the trees. Barber closed rapidly, his airspeed more than 100 miles per hour faster than the bomber. At approximately 200 yards range, he opened fire with his 450 caliber machine guns and his 20mm cannon. The stream of bullets walked across the bomber's right wing, shredding metal, hitting the engine. The engine began smoking. Barber's fire continued across the fuselage and tail. The bomber lurched downward, its right wing dropping. Barber was closing too fast, the range down to less than 100 feet. He snap-rolled right to avoid collision, pulling hard to break away. When he rolled wings level again and looked back, all he could see was black smoke rising from the jungle. The bomber had crashed. Lieutenant Holmes had finally shaken his drop tanks loose. He and Lieutenant Hine dove late, but spotted the second bomber turning out to sea at wave-top altitude. The bomber pilot had reacted differently than the first, heading for the water rather than land, perhaps hoping to find a Japanese patrol boat if his aircraft was damaged. Holmes closed on the bomber from behind and above, firing long bursts. His bullets stitched across the bomber's fuselage and engines. Hine fired as well, adding his firepower to Holmes's attack. The bomber's engines began trailing smoke. The aircraft wobbled but continued flying, skimming just feet above the waves. Behind them, several Zeros had broken through the American cover group and were chasing the P-38s. Barber, after shooting down the first bomber, rolled out and found himself closing on the damaged bomber that Holmes and Hine had been attacking. He fired another long burst. More hits. The bomber's engines were both smoking heavily now. Suddenly the bomber's nose dropped and it plunged into the ocean, disintegrating on impact. Water and debris erupted skyward. The engagement had lasted perhaps 3 minutes. Both Japanese bombers were destroyed. The 6 Zero fighters were scattered, several damaged. But Lieutenant Hine's P-38 had been hit during the fight. Other pilots saw him heading out to sea with one engine smoking, losing altitude. He did not respond to radio calls. He did not return to base. His body was never recovered. The remaining 15 P-38s regrouped and turned southeast on a direct course for Henderson Field. Mitchell checked his fuel gauges. The numbers were grim. The low-altitude outbound leg, the climb to intercept altitude, the combat maneuvering, all had consumed fuel faster than planned. The fighters were burning their last reserves. Mitchell calculated they might reach Henderson Field, but it would be close. Some might have to divert to the emergency strip at Russell Islands. Some might not make it at all. The return flight was tense and silent. Pilots constantly monitored fuel gauges, engine temperatures, oil pressures. They flew in loose formation, conserving fuel, maintaining altitude for maximum efficiency. Guadalcanal appeared on the horizon after nearly an hour of flying. Henderson Field's runway came into view. The P-38s began landing one by one. As the 13th fighter cleared the runway and began taxiing toward the parking area, its engines sputtered and died. Fuel exhaustion. The pilot had made it to base with perhaps seconds of fuel remaining. Lieutenant Holmes couldn't make it to Henderson Field and diverted to the Russell Island Strip, landing there with nearly dry tanks. Captain Lanphier arrived with sufficient fuel to perform a victory roll over the field before landing. He also broke radio silence with an air-to-ground transmission in plain English that clearly referenced shooting down Yamamoto. This violated operational security in multiple ways, identifying the target and potentially compromising the code-breaking secret if Japanese listening posts intercepted the transmission. 14 fighters had returned safely. One was lost, Lieutenant Hine presumably shot down by Zeros. The mission had destroyed both Japanese bombers and scattered the fighter escort without losing any other aircraft. From a tactical standpoint, the mission was an overwhelming success. The planning had been precise. The navigation had been perfect. The execution had been flawless. The pilots had performed exactly as trained. Major Mitchell's calculations had been so accurate that one fighter exhausted its fuel within seconds of landing. The intelligence had been absolutely correct about timing, location, aircraft types, escort numbers, everything. It was the most perfect interception in the history of air warfare. But whether Yamamoto had been killed remained unknown. The Americans had shot down 2 bombers, not 1. They didn't know which bomber carried Yamamoto. They didn't know if anyone survived. They wouldn't know for certain until the Japanese released the information. Japanese search parties reached the jungle crash site on the morning of April 19th, one day after the attack. They found the wreckage of Admiral Yamamoto's bomber scattered across a small clearing. The aircraft had hit the trees and disintegrated. Bodies lay in the wreckage. Yamamoto's body was still strapped in his seat, still holding his katana sword with one white-gloved hand. The sword grip showed his fingers had clenched tight in his final moment. Medical examination revealed he had been killed by 2 .50 caliber bullets, one entering behind his left shoulder blade, traveling through his body and exiting near his right collarbone. The second bullet entering his left jaw and exiting near his right eye. He had died from the gunfire, not from the crash. The bullets had come from behind and below, the angle consistent with an attack from a fighter pursuing from directly astern and slightly below the bomber's altitude. This matched Lieutenant Barber's description of his attack exactly and contradicted Captain Lanphier's claim of shooting from a 90-degree angle. The physical evidence was clear, though it would be years before American investigators fully understood the details. The bomber that crashed into the sea had carried Admiral Matome Ugaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff. 3 people survived that crash, including Ugaki himself, pulled from the water by Japanese patrol boats. But Yamamoto was dead. The commander of the Japanese combined fleet, architect of Pearl Harbor, the most capable naval strategist Japan possessed, was killed on Palm Sunday 1943 by American bullets while flying a routine inspection visit to forward bases. The Japanese Navy immediately began investigating how American fighters happened to intercept Yamamoto's flight at the exact time and location of his arrival. The precision of the interception seemed impossible to explain by coincidence or random patrolling. Some Japanese officers suspected intelligence compromise. Others believed Australian coast watchers had spotted the flight departing Rabaul and radioed a warning that allowed American fighters to launch and intercept. The Coast Watcher explanation was plausible, if not fully satisfactory. Japanese Navy security officers examined recent operations, looking for patterns that might indicate code compromise. They found nothing definitive. The investigation eventually concluded that the interception resulted from aggressive American fighter patrols and unfortunate timing. This conclusion was wrong, but it served to protect the American code-breaking secret. Commander Edwin Layton in Hawaii learned of Yamamoto's death through the same intelligence channels that had provided his itinerary. Japanese naval messages discussing Yamamoto's death and funeral arrangements were intercepted, decoded, and translated. The mission had succeeded. Yamamoto was dead. The Americans had executed perhaps the most audacious aerial assassination in history. But the relief Layton felt was mixed with profound anxiety. The Japanese were investigating. They were asking questions. They were examining their security procedures. Every day that passed without the Japanese changing their codes was a gift. Every intercepted message that showed the Japanese still using the compromised code was a small victory. The anxiety lasted for weeks, then months. The Japanese never changed their naval codes. The investigation apparently satisfied Japanese security officers that their codes remained secure. The American code-breaking secret survived. Layton could breathe again, but the danger had been real and immediate. One small mistake, one security breach, one indiscreet comment could have exposed everything. That security breach nearly happened in early May, 3 weeks after the mission. Captain Lanfear and Lieutenant Barber were granted 10 days leave for in New Zealand. They met Brigadier General Dean Strother, Chief of Solomon Fighter Command, at a golf course. Associated Press correspondent J. Norman Lodge approached them, having heard rumors about the Yamamoto mission. Lodge asked for details to fill out his story. Incredibly, all 3 men talked freely. Lanfear described his attack. Barber described his attack. Strother confirmed that American intelligence had been tracking Yamamoto for days and knew his exact itinerary. The security violations were staggering. Lodge filed his story on May 11th, 10 days before the Japanese publicly announced Yamamoto's death. The story described American intelligence tracking Yamamoto, pilots knowing specifically they were hunting Yamamoto, details of the attack, and General Strother's confirmation about knowing the itinerary in advance. Lodge's story never mentioned code-breaking explicitly, but the details screamed intelligence compromise to anyone reading carefully. Military censors blocked Lodge's story immediately and sent it directly to Admiral Halsey. Halsey read the story, understood instantly how catastrophic its publication would be, and summoned Lanfear, Barber, and Strother to his headquarters. Lieutenant Barber later described what happened. Admiral Halsey delivered a tirade of profanity, the like of which I had never heard before. He accused us of everything from being traitors to our country, to being so stupid we had no right to wear the American uniform. He said we should be court-martialed, reduced to privates, and jailed for talking to Lodge. The fury was not performance. Halsey understood that these 3 officers had nearly destroyed the most valuable intelligence asset of the Pacific War. Lodge's story, if published, would tell the Japanese everything they needed to know. American intelligence had tracked Yamamoto for days. American pilots knew specifically they were hunting Yamamoto. American commanders had known his detailed itinerary. The only possible source for this level of intelligence was code-breaking. If the story published, the Japanese would change their codes within days. Every American advantage gained from reading Japanese naval communications would vanish. Admiral Mitscher had recommended all 4 killer pilots, plus Major Mitchell for the Medal of Honor, the highest American military decoration. Halsey downgraded all recommendations to Navy Cross, the second highest decoration. The downgrade apparently resulted from the security violations. Lanfear's victory roll and radio call had violated radio silence and operational security. His discussion with Lodge had nearly compromised the war's most important secret. Barber's discussion with Lodge, while less egregious than Lanfear's, still constituted a massive security breach. The recommendation downgrade was punishment, sending a message that heroism in combat did not excuse security violations. Brigadier General Strother apparently suffered no career consequences, eventually rising to 4-star general and commanding NORAD. The double standard was notable, but perhaps reflected Strother's political connections compared to junior fighter pilots. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill had received the same decoded message that went to Admiral Nimitz and President Roosevelt. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park had been reading Japanese diplomatic and some military codes since early in the war. The Yamamoto itinerary decrypt reached Churchill within hours of its interception. Churchill's reaction was immediate and emphatic. Do nothing. Take no action. The intelligence was too perfect, the risk too great. Acting on this message would expose code breaking to anyone in Japanese intelligence with basic analytical skills. Churchill understood that Japanese codes and German codes were related. The Japanese might share security concerns with their German allies. If the Japanese changed their codes after the Yamamoto incident, they might recommend the Germans examine their own code security. This could lead to discovering that British codebreakers had been reading German Enigma messages for years. The ultra-secret, the breaking of German military codes, was Britain's most crucial advantage in the European war. Churchill would sacrifice almost anything to protect it, including passing up the opportunity to kill Yamamoto. Churchill sent urgent messages to Washington recommending against acting on the Yamamoto intelligence. Whether these messages reached Roosevelt before the mission executed remains unclear. Post-war examination of Roosevelt's schedule suggests he was traveling when the messages arrived. Decisions had to be made quickly, within 72 hours of intercepting the Japanese message. Communication delays, Roosevelt's travel schedule, and the need for rapid action meant the decision fell primarily to Nimitz, with Knox's authorization. When Churchill learned the Americans had intercepted and killed Yamamoto, he was reportedly furious. British intelligence sharing with the Americans ceased immediately. The blackout lasted several weeks. Churchill's anger reflected genuine fear that the Americans had jeopardized everything. Only after weeks passed without Japanese code changes did Churchill's rage subside. The intelligence sharing gradually resumed, but the tension illustrated the stakes involved. Two allied nations, fighting the same enemies, nearly had a rupture in their relationship over the question of whether killing one admiral was worth risking their greatest intelligence advantages. The psychological transformation that Commander Layton experienced during those weeks after the mission was profound and documented in his personal correspondence. In letters to his wife, carefully censored for security, but revealing an emotional tone, Layton described his state of mind. Before the mission, he had been confident, excited, convinced they should act. The intelligence was perfect. The opportunity was unprecedented. Yamamoto's death would demoralize Japan and eliminate their best naval mind. All the arguments seemed solid. But after the mission, after Lanfear's radio call, after Lodge's story was filed, after Churchill's messages arrived expressing fury, Layton's confidence evaporated. He realized they had been playing with fire. One indiscretion, one security breach, one lucky guess by Japanese intelligence could have cost them everything. The code-breaking advantage that had helped win at Midway, that guided American strategy throughout the Pacific, that would continue providing crucial intelligence until war's end had been risked for one man. Layton's diary entries from May 1943 show his evolving understanding. We believed we were executing a brilliant tactical strike against a valuable target. We were correct about that. But we nearly destroyed our ability to execute any such strikes in the future. If Lanphier had been slightly more indiscreet, if Lodge's story had been published by a censor's error, if the Japanese had been slightly more thorough in their investigation, we would have lost everything. The risk-benefit calculation that seemed so obvious in April appears much different now. We succeeded tactically, but nearly failed strategically. I question whether I provided Admiral Nimitz with adequate warning about the risks. I understood the intelligence value of the code breaking. I understood the possibility of compromise. But I did not adequately communicate the fragility of our advantage. One mistake, one breach, and it vanishes forever. We made several mistakes. We had several breaches. By fortune or providence, we escaped the consequences. But it was closer than anyone outside a small circle will ever know. The contrast between what American commanders believed before the mission and what they understood after was stark. Before, they saw an opportunity to kill an important enemy leader with acceptable risk. The cover story about Australian coast watchers seemed adequate. The pilots could be briefed to maintain operational security. The Japanese would investigate, but probably conclude it was unfortunate timing. After the mission, after the security violations piled up, after the investigation reports showed Japanese security officers asking hard questions, the commanders understood how thin their margin for error had been. The Australian Coast Watcher cover story was transparent fiction that would not survive serious scrutiny. The pilots had largely understood their intelligence came from code breaking, regardless of what they were told. The Japanese investigation had come closer to the truth than anyone felt comfortable admitting. Only Japanese institutional assumptions about their code security, and perhaps Japanese reluctance to admit such a catastrophic security failure, had prevented them from reaching the correct conclusion. Admiral Yamamoto's death produced exactly the effects on Japanese morale that Layton had predicted. The Japanese people revered Yamamoto. His careful planning had produced Japan's string of early victories. His understanding of modern naval aviation had shaped Japanese carrier doctrine. His strategic vision had conceived the Pearl Harbor attack and the subsequent offensive operations. His death was announced to the Japanese public on May 21st, 5 weeks after his death, after arrangements were made for a state funeral. The announcement devastated Japanese civilian morale. Military morale suffered similarly. Yamamoto had been seen as irreplaceable, the one leader capable of matching American industrial capacity with Japanese tactical excellence. His replacement, Admiral Mineichi Koga, was competent but uninspiring. Koga lacked Yamamoto's imaginative strategic thinking, his willingness to take calculated risks, his charisma that inspired subordinates. Under Koga's leadership, Japanese naval operations became more cautious and conventional. Whether this resulted from Koga's personality or from Japan's deteriorating strategic position remains debated, but the correlation was noted by both Japanese and American observers. The strategic impact extended beyond morale. Japanese naval doctrine had been built around aggressive carrier operations and decisive fleet engagements. Yamamoto had trained his commanders to seek battle, to press advantages, to take risks for decisive victories. Koga's doctrine emphasized preservation of forces, avoiding attrition battles, waiting for opportunities rather than creating them. This defensive mindset reflected Japan's weakening position, but also Koga's more conservative temperament. After Koga assumed command, the Japanese Navy did not win another significant fleet engagement. The battles of the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf in 1944 were Japanese defeats. Whether Yamamoto could have produced different results is speculative. But American commanders, including Nimitz and Halsey, believed Yamamoto's death was strategically significant. Captain Lanfear's victory roll over Henderson Field, while a security violation, reflected genuine achievement. The mission had succeeded on multiple levels: tactical success, strategic impact, intelligence, security maintained despite close calls, and American aircrew performance that demonstrated growing American tactical proficiency. The broader context of Pacific War dynamics in April 1943 makes the Yamamoto mission's significance clearer. Japan's strategic position was deteriorating, but not yet desperate. Japanese forces still held vast, conquered territories. Japanese industry still produced aircraft and ships. Japanese veterans still possessed combat experience advantages over newly trained American pilots. But the fundamental balance was shifting. American industrial production was accelerating exponentially. New Essex-class carriers were joining the fleet. Thousands of trained pilots were completing training. American submarine operations were strangling Japanese merchant shipping. Japanese oil, rubber, and raw material supplies from conquered territories were not reaching home islands in sufficient quantities. American advances in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea were progressing steadily. Japanese defensive perimeters were being compressed. Strategic initiative was passing to American forces. Yamamoto understood all this. His planning incorporated these realities. His operations attempted to maximize Japanese tactical advantages, while those advantages still existed. His death removed the one Japanese leader who fully grasped both American capabilities and Japanese limitations. Lieutenant Rex Barber's borrowed P-38 returned to Henderson Field with 104 bullet holes counted by ground crews. The bullets had come from Zero fighters that pursued him after his attack on Yamamoto's bomber. Several rounds had passed through control surfaces. One had punctured a wing fuel tank. Another had damaged his right engine cowling. That he had flown the damaged aircraft 400 miles back to base demonstrated both P-38 ruggedness and Barber's flying skill. The dent in the aircraft's underside came from debris flying off Yamamoto's bomber as Barber fired into it at close range. Barber's flying technique emphasized closing to near collision range before firing to ensure hits. This aggressive tactic produced results, but also produced damage from debris and return fire. The borrowed P-38 was repaired and returned to service. Barber continued flying combat missions throughout 1943, accumulating additional victories before rotating back to the United States for training duties. The debate over who shot down Yamamoto's bomber began immediately after the mission and continued for decades. Captain Lanfear claimed from the start that he had attacked Yamamoto's bomber from a 90-degree deflection angle, his bullets tearing off the bomber's right wing, causing it to crash in the jungle. Lieutenant Barber claimed he attacked a bomber from directly behind, his bullets walking across the bomber from right wing through fuselage to tail, causing the bomber to crash in the jungle. Both pilots claimed to have shot down the bomber that crashed in the jungle. Only later did they learn that Yamamoto had died in the jungle crash, not the ocean crash. Lanfear's claim and Barber's claim contradicted each other. Both could not be correct. The Army Air Force initially split credit, giving Lanfear and Barber each half credit for destroying Yamamoto's bomber. But the contradictions never resolved. The physical evidence supported Barber's account. All bullet holes in the wreckage came from behind. The right wing separated during the crash, not during flight. Japanese witnesses, including Zero pilot Warrant Officer Kenji Yanagiya, interviewed in the 1970s after years of silence, described watching Yamamoto's bomber shot down by a fighter attacking from directly behind. Multiple official investigations examined the claims. Air Force Historical Reviews in 1987 and 1991 analyzed all available evidence. The reviews concluded that Barber alone shot down Yamamoto's bomber. Lanfear's claim was unsupported by physical evidence, contradicted by Japanese witnesses, and inconsistent with the wreckage examination. Lanfear had effectively engaged and scattered the Zero escorts, enabling Barber and the other killer pilots to attack the bombers without interference. This was crucial to mission success. But Lanfear's actual shooting down of Yamamoto's bomber appeared unsupported by evidence. The controversy became bitter in later years, as both pilots wrote books and gave interviews promoting their versions. Lanfear was more aggressive in public relations, giving many interviews and maintaining his claim until his death in 1987. Barber was more reticent, but maintained his account was accurate. Independent investigations by aviation historians consistently supported Barber's version. Today, most historians credit Barber with shooting down Yamamoto's bomber, Holmes and Hine with fatal damage to Ugaki's bomber that crashed in the ocean, and Lanfear with scattering the Zero escorts. The mission name, Operation Vengeance, was never used during the war. No operational name was assigned at the time. The mission was referred to in contemporary documents as the Yamamoto Mission, or the Yamamoto Interception, or simply by date. The name Operation Vengeance first appeared in John Dean Potter's 1965 book about Yamamoto. Potter apparently chose the name to reflect the Pearl Harbor revenge motive that motivated American planners. The name resonated and was subsequently adopted by many historians and popular accounts. Official Air Force historical archives contain no reference to Operation Vengeance as a wartime designation. This historical footnote illustrates how popular memory sometimes creates names and narratives that did not exist during actual events. The mission was real. The planning was meticulous. The execution was flawless. But the dramatic name was retroactive, applied 22 years after the event by an author seeking a compelling title. Today, a memorial stands near the crash site in Bougainville. The remote jungle location remained undisturbed for years after the war. Occasional visitors during the 1950s and 60s found wreckage fragments scattered through the vegetation. In later decades, the Papua New Guinea government designated the site as historically significant. A monument was erected describing the events of April 18, 1943. Japanese visitors occasionally traveled to the site to pay respects to Yamamoto. American veterans of the mission, including Rex Barber, visited in the 1980s and 1990s. The meetings between American attackers and Japanese defenders at the crash site years later were reportedly cordial, marked by mutual respect for warriors who had done their duty in wartime. Barber expressed regret at killing Yamamoto, whom he described as a worthy opponent and capable leader. Japanese veterans expressed understanding that Barber had been following orders and executing his mission as trained. The reconciliation reflected the passage of time and changing context. What had been mortal combat in 1943 became history by the 1980s. Examined by old men who shared the experience of surviving that war and witnessing the peaceful world that followed. The universal lesson extracted from the Yamamoto mission concerns the fragility of intelligence advantages and the risks inherent in exploiting them. Intelligence is valuable only while secret. Using intelligence risks exposing it. The more perfectly intelligence is used, the greater the risk of exposure. American commanders understood this in abstract before the mission. They learned it viscerally afterward when security breaches nearly destroyed the secret they had tried to protect. The mathematical precision of the interception, the perfect timing, the exact location, all screamed intelligence compromise to anyone analyzing the event carefully. Only Japanese institutional assumptions about code security, and perhaps institutional reluctance to admit catastrophic failure, prevented them from reaching the correct conclusion. The Americans were lucky. They succeeded tactically and strategically, while maintaining their crucial intelligence advantage through a combination of careful planning and fortunate Japanese investigation conclusions. But they were lucky, not invincible. The margin for error was thinner than anyone admitted at the time. Commander Layton's moment of holding Major Laswell's decrypt in the early morning hours of April 14th, Hawaiian time, which seemed like an extraordinary intelligence coup, actually represented something more complex and more fragile. The decrypt was perfect. The intelligence was flawless. The opportunity was unprecedented. But the very perfection created danger. Using it required accepting risks that became clear only in retrospect. Layton's initial question, "This has to be a trap," was more insightful than he realized. Not a Japanese trap, but a trap of their own creation. A trap where success required near-perfect operational security from everyone involved, from planners to pilots, to reporters to censors. A trap where one mistake could undo years of cryptanalytic work. A trap where the tactical benefit of killing one admiral had to be weighed against the strategic cost of potentially losing the ability to read Japanese communications for the remainder of the war. They sprang the trap successfully. But examining the full story reveals how close they came to catching themselves in it. The message that Layton held that morning represented both opportunity and danger in perfect balance. History remembers the opportunity. Participants remembered the danger.